So let's implement a structure that supports the onion architecture in our solution. Now to start off with, I'm going to create solution folders and projects to represent the layers of the onion architecture. Then I'm going to move the code into the right places. So in my solution, I'm going to start off by creating a clients folder. Oops. Okay, now I'm going to create a solution folder for business interfaces. Then I'm going to create a solution for repository interfaces. I'm going to create a solution folder for the domain. Now I'm going to move my UI project up into clients. I'm going to create a new class library in business interfaces. I'm going to use our three-part naming convention of company, then of company dash, and then whatever the solution name is, online store, and then the project specific name, so business interfaces. Now, so this is the business, so this is where we're going to put all of the interfaces that define the plugs in our business logic layer. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing with our repository interfaces. And now I'm going to create a class library for our domain model. And that's where we'll store all of our domain entities like customer and order and product. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I've created those empty projects. Now I'm going to jump back up into my online store and I'm going to start looking at moving my projects to where they belong. So I could go in and I could just copy and paste them or cut and paste them, but then I'd be left up with a lot of broken code. So I'm going to use some of the refactoring tools that are available to me. So there are refactoring tools built into Visual Studio, but I'm going to use the refactoring tools that I get from using ReSharper. So I'm going to open up my entities, and so I can right click on one of my entities. So I'll show by opening it up and order, and I can say refactor, I can say move to folder, and I can specify where I want to move it to. And I'm going to let it fix the namespace. So now what I'm doing is I'm moving. It's telling me here that because there's not a reference from my online store to that domain project, I'm going to need to add a reference and add some usages, but that's fine. Okay, so I've moved the order class. Next, I'm going to move the customer class. Okay, so now I've moved my models so I've moved my domain models out of my online store down to where they belong in this project called domain model. And what that represents is I've moved them from being up here in clients down to the very core of our onion. Okay, now I'm just going to compile that, and there'll be a few errors. So what I'm saying, I'm up here in my web project, and what it's saying is that I can't get a reference. There's no reference down to my domain project. So I could come in here, right click on references, go add reference, go into my projects, and add a reference down from my web project down to my domain model. Okay, now that it's done that, it's telling me that I need a using statement, and now that's fixed that bit of, now that's fixed that up, and we'll see where else we might just need a couple more using statements. And now the project compiles again. Fantastic. So the next thing I'm going to move out, let's have a look back in my models, is I'm going to move out some of my repository interfaces. So in my data project, I created an iCustom repository. So I'm going to move that down, so that should be moved, my iCustom repository should be moved into it's my data access interfaces. So it's the socket for data access in the core application. So I should be moving it down into my repository interfaces project. So I'm going to open it up. I'm going to say move, and I'm going to move it into my repository interfaces project. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same thing for order repository. I'm going to tell it to move it to repository interfaces. Okay, and just the same way that I needed to add a reference from my UI project to my domain model to fix the references, I'll now have to add one from my UI project down to my repository interfaces project. Now I could do the same thing, and I could come back up into my project and right click on it and go into my references, and then, but I'm actually just going to use, so ReSharper will give me a bit of a hand here, so I can just go onto this error, hit Alt Enter, and I can actually let ReSharper add the reference for me. So that saved me some work. So there it is in my orders repository. Now if I go and check the custom repository, I'll have to add my references there. Now when I come into my repository project, I'm also getting an error because my repository interfaces project also doesn't have a reference to my domain. So I'm going to come on here onto customer and hit Alt Enter and say use this reference. So that resolves that issue, and now I can build again. Oh, oops, I forgot to add the using statement into the controller. Let's make sure we build. So as you can see, as I'm doing each refactoring, so excellent. So you can see I'm fixing up my errors as I go along. So I'm moving a couple of files, and then I'm fixing all the errors. I'm not doing a whole lot of changes and then trying to fix all the errors. I'm doing them in small batches. And usually I'd be doing a commit as I move and fix each little section. Okay, let's have a look here and see what else we can tidy up. So I've also got my file system logger, and I've got my iLogger interface. Now, I could move that. So some people would move this out into, they'd say this is business, but I'm actually going to move my logger down into the domain. Because I use my logger in lots and lots and lots of places in the application, I also want the ability to log from some of my domain objects. So I'm going to move this to a file, but people will have different opinions on where this should go. But I like my logger in my domain model. But my notification provider belongs in the business layer. So I'm going to move him into my business interfaces. Okay, so now I'm going to have a few references to fix up. So you can see I'm just using Alt Enter, which is the ReSharper shortcut for fixing, which will fix a lot of things here. And there we go. Excellent. And now I'm building again. So what you can see is now I'm moving everything out. I'm moving, when we started refactoring, everything just was all sitting inside the one project. What we've done is we've created different projects for the different layers of our onion. And what we're doing is we're moving the code from just being in one big ball down to being nicely separated out. Okay, so we're getting much better maintainability because we're putting everything where it belongs to go. Okay, so we've moved out our notification provider into our business interfaces, our customer and order repositories into our repository interfaces project, and our logger and our customer and order entities into our domain model. You can still see though where we've got the implementations of our repositories and our loggers and our senders all still in the core application. Now, where are they going to go into? So if we think about it in terms of our onion, we don't want them to belong in the core of the application. They exist outside of the application, and then we dependency inject them. So what I'm going to do, so what I would usually do is come in here and add another solution item folder. Now, the numbers don't mean anything at the beginning of these folders. They're just used there to keep them in order. So I put 5 and some dashes in just to make a separator to make it clear that up the top here, what we have is the core of our application. We have our clients, our business interfaces, our repository interfaces in our domain. And what we're going to do down below is we're going to add some projects that are going to contain our dependencies, but these correspond to the right-hand side of our diagram. This is the area that's all being injected. So I'm going to create a project for my business logic implementation, another one for my repository implementation. In reality, we'd end up with lots of these different dependency projects. So I'm going to create a project for my business dependencies and a project for my data. I actually didn't know that very well. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to refactor down my business dependencies and my data dependencies to where they belong. So I can actually just move this whole folder. So I'm going to go in there and I can say move this whole folder of the data dependencies down into the data project. Oops. There we go. It's giving me lots of warnings. And the reason it's giving me lots of warnings is that my data dependencies is going to need a reference. So my data dependency here is going to need a reference back to my repository interfaces project and back to my domain entities. So that's nice and easily solved though. I'm just going to right click and say add that reference. Then I'm going to right click and say add the reference to the domain as well. Add those using statements. Excellent. And now I'll move my business implementations for logging and messaging. So I'm going to move the file system logger. I'll just move that to business, though that may not necessarily be where we would usually put it. Doesn't like that one. Let's fix up the errors with compiling first. Okay, so I'm going to move my email sender and my SMS sender both. I'm going to move both of those into the business dependency. I don't know why it's not letting me move those. Okay. And so now what I need to do is I just need to move the file system logger. I'm just going to move that to the business dependency. Okay, so I'm just going to move the file system logger down into my business dependencies project along with the email sender. Okay, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to fix up the references. I need to move down my helper class, which I'm going to move down into my domain model. Okay, so I've got my email sender, my file system logger, delete that one there. Okay, we just need to add a reference. Great. So now what I've done is I've moved most of my models out of my models folder. Okay, in my web project, and I've moved them all down. I've moved them into the layers of my Onion architecture. I've moved them, if they're sockets, I've moved them into business interfaces or repository interfaces. If they're the core of the application, I've moved them into the domain model. Or if they're dependencies that should be injected into the application, I've moved them into other assemblies that I can, so that I can easily, if I decide that I want to change that particular implementation, I can actually just add a new implementation in a new assembly and change how it gets injected in my dependency resolver. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just have a look at my I'm going to use my Resharper. So Resharper has a great tool called which will generate a dependency graph. So I can actually come in here and I can get an overview of my application. So I can see that my UI is depending on my data dependencies and business dependencies, my repository interfaces, business interfaces, and my domain model. Now I'm just going to run the application. Okay, it looks like on my controller I'm getting an error. It looks like, so what that will be is that the view will be missing a reference. So I'm going to go into my view and it's looking for customer, but it can't find it. There we go, so I'll update that and refresh my view. Oops, I used the wrong customer object. So now you can see the application is running, but what I've done is I've actually sorted it out into the correct layers, into the layers of the Onion architecture.